Welcome to episode 3 of the Threats and Trends podcast. My name is Caleb, and today we've got a fantastic guest. This is Amanda Talks Geopolitics. She's on TikTok and a bunch of other places, including YouTube. And Amanda, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited.
So thank you for joining as well. And for folks that haven't gotten to encounter your content yet, do you mind kind of introducing yourself and what you cover?
Sure. So I'm mainly on TikTok, although I'm expanding to YouTube. And I started on TikTok mainly talking about the conflict in Israel after October 7th. I have a background in religious studies with a concentration in like Middle East history, or the Abraham religions, really. And so that's kind of been a primary focus of mine for since October 7th, which I guess was a year and a half ago. But I'm expanding more of my content to kind of teach people about the American perspective of conflicts. Um, so China, Taiwan, like Israel, Iran, or all of Iran's proxies, Russia, Ukraine, kind of. I think a lot of the content, and yours is very good, but a lot of people, like the people who are most into these conflicts, come at it from a perspective of that country first. And I think I'm hoping to add to the conversation like the American position for a lot of those things. So thank you again for having me.
Of course, and that's all fantastic. We'll go ahead and jump to slides for today. As far as what we got, we're talking about, and it seems like we do not have the slides. Here we go. Tech difficulty on my side. Episode 3. Here we go. We're talking about potential threats to the United States, or how the U.S. could get drawn into some of these conflicts. So it actually, funny enough, ties right in. I think there's a few different places that we could be looking at here. Of course, we've got Iran. We'll probably start there. China, Taiwan as well. Russia, Ukraine, the cartels. And then, of course, we have optional conflicts if we ever want to talk about that. Thinking like Greenland, Canada, and Panama Canal. I have that as optional, as if it's like, oh, yeah, like we're totally going to get into that. But, I just think we've got people talking about it. So, we'll just have it there, I guess. But what do you think? You want to start with Iran?
Totally. Sure, definitely.
Sweet. Yeah, and so and it's actually funny. 30 minutes before we jumped on, there was a news story that just dropped, basically discussing how Israel had been planning to strike Iranian nuclear facilities. Was it a month from now? But the White House had basically yanked their leash back and said, "No, you're not going to do it. We're going to negotiate." So that kind of illustrates where we're at with this situation. There's the meeting in Rome between the United States and Iranian ambassadors on April 19th. That is this Saturday after this recording. And they will continue to negotiate on what's next. And from the reporting that we've been hearing, it sounds like the U.S. is kind of, I don't want to say waffling on its position, but moving away from total denuclearization and more towards this position of let's just make a new nuclear deal, even if it's a repackaged version of the JCPOA, which was signed under President Obama. What are your thoughts on all of this so far in the negotiations?
So I didn't see that headline, but that surprises me a little bit. Although I think as we move forward with this specific issue, we're going to see a lot of it's pretty heavily propagandized. So you can see like the people saying, well, this is going to get us into another war. It's very unlikely that this leads to like an actual like ground invasion of Iran. Like that's not going to happen. Mike Duran of the Hudson Institute wrote a really good essay in Tablet magazine last week where he talked about Trump's foreign policy, saying that like the zigzagging is the strategy. The fact that nobody quite knows what he's going to do is probably his he's using that to his advantage, and that's what I would say is probably happening here with these nuclear talks. Iran doesn't quite know, is he going to negotiate? Is he not going to negotiate? Are we going to, bomb them? We have a lot of stuff in the military, right? Or like in the Middle East right now, like more than we had for the Gulf War, I believe. So that's on the table. And it surprises me that Israel would have a plan to strike. From what I understood, this would have been an American-led strike. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I can kind of see why Israel would feel the need to take matters into their own hands. It's obviously far more existential to them than it is the United States. But I agree with you. I mean, obviously, it would it'd be some sort of aerial operation primarily.
Mhm.
I'm kind of curious. Included here that the U.S. has continued strikes against the Houthis, and there have been reports over the past week that the Yemeni military or maybe I should say, be preparing a ground attack into Houthi-controlled territory, potentially towards support of Hodeidah, which is a very obviously strategic position in Yemen. I think that's related, obviously, to Iran. The Houthis have received a significant amount of material and non-material support from Iran, and whatever happens in Yemen is, in my opinion, directly connected to what's going on in Iran.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the thought was always that Hezbollah was kind of the last line of defense between Israel and or Iran and the West. And now that Hezbollah's, I think they're down to about a third of their capacity, and there's some really promising stuff coming out of Lebanon right now. I guess the president is forcing the removal of all Hezbollah flags from the Shia areas, which is kind of insane. I never thought I would see something like that. And it's I don't know that I fully trust the Lebanese government to fully take care of Hezbollah, but that's a promising sign. So now that Hezbollah has been mostly gutted, it looks like they're kind of going to reintegrate former Hezbollah members into the Lebanese army and strip them of their weapons. I think the Houthis are kind of that last line of defense that couldn't really defend Iran. They're so far south and stuff, but they could cause a lot of problems in Israel if the nuclear facilities are taken out. And I think if they were severely weakened, that would be the best time to strike. There's nothing really else that could come to Iran's defense or something, or retaliate.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And it's so interesting seeing just how fast things have shifted for Iran. I mean, it's obviously kind of crazy to consider that October 7th was a year and a half ago. What a crazy year and a half it's been. But also, time has been flying. And it's been kind of a nightmarish worst case scenario for Iran in that time, where they've gone in kind of a direct tit for tat with Israel directly in that phase. They're some of the most powerful proxies, Hezbollah, Hamas, to a lesser or more of a looser extent, I guess, getting just annihilated in that phase. And now Iran is incredibly vulnerable. Oh, not to mention Syria and Assad, by the way. How can I forget them? Huge. And so that air corridor is wide open. There's nobody stopping Israel except for Iran. And there's the open question of, can Iran actually stop Israel? And the question is no, of course not. So nightmare scenario for Iran. They're in a very vulnerable position with these negotiations going on. And that has me wondering, why should the U.S. alter its position and not go for the kill with total denuclearization? I know that it's kind of I have it obviously listed here as a total non-starter for Iran. The Ayatollah has been very clear about it on social media, and same with other government accounts online. But what do they have to negotiate with? What's their leverage?
Well, and I think too, when you look at like what Middle Eastern leaders say, Iran is going to say, yeah, absolutely not. We're not going to denuclearize until they have to, right? Until they make the deal. Just like we are saying, it's a non-starter for them to obtain a nuclear weapon. And we've seen Steve Witkoff go back and forth a little bit about that, which is very worrying to me. Ultimately, I think if we look at President Trump's record, he is pretty clear on what he thinks about this issue. Same with Marco Rubio, same with Pete Hegseth. So I'm thinking that we're probably going to engage in a strike like this. I think if we were going to do some sort of a deal, if it was a Libya type deal, where I think that was 2003, we completely put Libya under sanctions. They had no money, and we approached Gaddafi saying, like, hey, you've just got to get rid of you have to denuclearize. He took that deal. Do the Iranians take that deal? And do Iranians in the diaspora want a deal to be done? That's another thing that I look at too. Yeah. They don't want a deal done. They want that regime toppled. So,
yeah, and I will say, to be fair for Iran, dubbing it, as I've seen in other places, the Libya model is probably the worst marketing you could possibly have for something like this.
Yeah.
Because I would imagine that the Ayatollah is probably looking at this like, well, let's just, cut out that middle phase between denuclearization and getting dragged through the sewer and hung, and let's just go straight to that. Like it's kind of I think that this is a set of existential concern and an insurance, like nuclear weapons acting as an insurance policy effectively for the regime. I'm not quite sure why they would want to give that up, but we do have, back to real quick. Sorry, before we get too far down this rabbit hole, because I'd like to continue. But real quick to Lebanon before we get too far. Dead Wardog asks, why is the Lebanese president taking down Hezbollah flags particularly significant? Is Lebanon following that with any other major action?
I can answer that.
Yep.
Yeah, so basically Lebanon has existed. It's a very separated society, I guess. So it's about a third Christian. They have an indigenous Christian population called the Maronites there, but there are other sects as well. Then there are Sunnis, and then there are Shias, and all of them make up about 30%. And then there's the Druze, which is an ethno-religious minority, like Arab kind of, or kind of Muslim, but they have to intermarry. They believe in reincarnation and things like that. And they're about maybe a little less than 10%. So with Hezbollah is just it's a state within a state, essentially, in certain areas of Lebanon. In south of the Litani River is majority Shia, Baalbek is majority Shia, and Dahia, which is the area of Beirut that Israel bombed when they killed Hassan Nasrallah, the former leader of Hezbollah, that is also majority Shia. And there's Hezbollah flags all over. So if you drive around Dahia, it's pictures of the Ayatollah of Iran and pictures of Nasrallah, and on these billboards and stuff. It feels like you're in another country because it kind of operates as a state within a state, and they were heavily funded by Iran. And Lebanon just kind of allowed them to do that because they also had all of these weapons. They were pretty popular, even with non-Shias throughout Lebanon for a while. And so Lebanon just kind of allowed them to exist that way, basically because at the end of Lebanon's civil war, they don't want to go back into a civil war. That was 15 years of brutal conflict. They don't want to approach this really heavily armed group of people and try and start another fight, basically, to get them to disarm. After Israel pretty much gutted Hezbollah, it's an interesting thing because Hezbollah is a political party in Lebanon too, and they're pretty powerful. Either Hezbollah or Hezbollah aligned parties make up almost half of the Lebanese parliament, and they were preventing Lebanon from actually electing a president and prime minister for the last 2 years. After Hezbollah was gutted, they've allowed a president to be elected, which they co-signed, and a prime minister. And the president and prime minister are trying to put Lebanon on a good path forward. And one of the ways they're doing that is saying no more militias with, religious militias that can drag our country into conflicts that we don't want to be dragged into. And so, so those are kind of the major actions that are being taken right now by the government in Lebanon.
Gotcha. Fantastic information there. Does Lebanon have the actual hard capability to enforce any mandate right now? Does their military have the capability to go in and start, pushing Hezbollah out of Hezbollah-controlled neighborhoods? Does the central government have that kind of authority, or not necessarily authority, but influence to back that up?
Do they have the will? I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Do they have the power? Maybe. We actually, the United States gives Lebanon military aid, defensive military aid, to try and make it so that Hezbollah can't be the fully dominant force. It's not been so much a question of power as will. And they are showing signs of having the will to do so. So I think I'm pretty optimistic between that and what we've seen happening with the fall of the Assad regime in Syria, because obviously Iran used Syria as a land bridge to rearm Hezbollah. So now that Hezbollah is gutted, I think they used to have the military capacity of like a mid-sized European country. And that's all gone. And it was not nearly the bloody war everybody thought it would be. I thought that would be the worst war that human eyes see in our lifetimes. It's not going. It wasn't that, thank God, because of really like the pager incident and Israel's like creativity with that. But now also Iran can't rearm Hezbollah, and with maximum pressure sanctions on Iran, they can't. They don't have the money to fully rearm Hezbollah to that degree. It took 20 years to build up to get to the point where they were such a threat. So,
Yeah. One of the, I think, more interesting facts about Hezbollah that at least I find very interesting is that it's not exclusively Shia Muslims inside of Hezbollah. It's a really pretty diverse organization, or at least it was, with some Christian groups that supported it as well. How has that changed since the conflict with Israel, and it kind of lost a lot of its military power, and it just doesn't have the game that it used to. I say it doesn't have the game that it used to. It's taken some serious losses.
mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think Hezbollah started to lose popular support throughout Lebanon when they were active in the Syrian civil war, and people saw how brutal and awful they were to people in Syria. Also, I mean, Lebanon took on, I want to say, 2 million Syrians, Syrian refugees. Lebanon's already a really, they have a lot of sectarian tension there. So to bring in a whole lot more people who are all majority Sunni in that case, that was never like that was contentious there for them. And so I think that that's when people really started to turn against Hezbollah. But it's weird because where Hezbollah operates, like in Dahya and in southern Lebanon, there are still Christian groups that if they want to go along to get along, then they have to play nice with Hezbollah. And Hezbollah was nice to them too. Like they would go rebuild their churches or something if Hezbollah destroyed them, or if Israel destroyed them because of Hezbollah. So, yeah, I mean, I think it's just kind of, do those groups want to go back down that path to take on Israel? I don't think so. But I guess we have to see.
Yeah, that makes sense. Real quick, kind of just jumping back to Iran. I know we're kind of hopping around topics here. And I guess we can kind of tie it together. Now that Hezbollah's, I mean, I guess for now taken care of, not completely, and Israel kind of is able to, obviously Gaza is still there. That's going to be, at least it looks like, something they're going to have to kind of focus back in on the ground in a similar capacity like they used to. But honestly, we can talk about that here in a second, because there's some interesting developments in Gaza that were not the case earlier. How does that shape, the Israeli picture of the Middle East? And this also includes kind of Turkey to a degree, because things today are very different from a year ago or 6 months ago, even, whenever there was the potential for a direct, conflict between Israel and Iran versus obviously today.
Yeah, I think Iran is probably open to negotiations at this point. I think what's also been interesting is Hezbollah has put out a couple really, statements about, the world needs to come together and help Gaza, but they don't say that they're going to give support anymore militarily, which is a big deal. Hezbollah is not entering militarily, even though they have launched a couple rockets from Lebanese territory at Israel again a couple weeks ago. But for the most part, that's taken care of. I mean, they still have rockets and things. Iran, I think, wants a deal. I think Hamas wants to be able to remain armed because they still have rockets and stuff down there. And they want to remain, I think, an armed political entity in Gaza, which Israel's not going to allow to happen. So it's just, how long is the global community okay with Israel's war in Gaza right now? I think with President Trump there, we're not going to see such outcries to stop that war, I guess, in my opinion.
I agree. And one of the, I think, more interesting developments that's been happening here in the past few weeks is you've got protests in Gaza against Hezbollah.
Or Hamas.
How is that? Or Hamas? My bad. Yeah.
They all start with H.
Yes, right. All ages. and all along the Mediterranean. But anyway,
Mhm.
how does that kind of change Israel's calculus with a ground invasion of Gaza a second time? Because there's some word that they are considering doing the exact same thing as before. Now that fighting's on the table again, but would that kind of shift public opinion back away from? I mean, they're never really probably going to be pro-Israel in any kind of sense, right? But away from anti-Hamas to maybe they're our only option in terms of resistance. In effect, a rally around the flag moment.
So, Richard Hanania had a really interesting piece right after the Israel-Gaza war started, saying that Gaza's probably maxed out on anti-Israel hate. I don't really think that any war that Israel pursues there could make them more anti-Israel. I mean, public opinion. I think there was something from Jared Kushner when he was talking about um, the Abraham Accords and what American approval, public opinion of America was in Gaza. And he heard from them, it's at an all-time low. We have a 6% approval rating in Gaza after the Abraham Accords were announced or something like that. And he said, whoa, what was it before? And they said it was 8% before. So, these are not people who like the West. They don't like America. They don't like Israel. They're not going to. I don't really think any type of war that Israel pursues is going to make them pro-Israel, or has the potential to make them more anti-Israel. I think it's just, to me, in my opinion, where Israel's kind of always gone wrong is they don't want to be in charge of the Palestinians. They want to give them some level of autonomy. And that's because the Palestinians, especially in the West, ask for autonomy, right? They say, we just want to have our own state, and we also don't want Israel to have a state. So when they allow for that autonomy, what happens is in these schools, they teach them, you know, basically to martyr themselves on behalf of the Palestinian state. And how do you have a peaceful two-state solution when one side's teaching their kids that a war is justified and it doesn't matter if it takes 100 years? In my opinion, what I would like to see is that we don't have these middlemen anymore. Somebody needs to take over that is willing to say, no, you can't do this kind of martyrdom education anymore. You don't have a chance at peace moving forward if you are teaching people this. And that's kind of the cultural sentiment. And I think that there's an appetite for that. I actually think that if you look at what's going on in Syria, um, he went by Al-Jilani. Now he's Ahmed al-Shara. I think he changed his name. The leader of HTS is a former Al-Qaeda offshoot, but he shaved the beard. He wears a suit now. He's talking about like modernization and wanting, peaceful coexistence. He doesn't go at the Israelis really. Israel's pushed up into Syrian territory to take care of the Druze, they say, and they don't really fight back. Like the new Syrian regime doesn't really fight back. So I think if we show Hamas, like, hey, look how much, or we show the people of Gaza, look how much better it's gotten for the people of Syria after Iran doesn't have control anymore because the Assad regime was like kind of on behalf of the Iranians. We could do something similar for you too and get like a ton of investment from the Gulf states and stuff. I think that's when things start looking better. But that can only happen if Hamas wants to give up power, and they don't right now. So
Yeah, there's so much to talk about. I'll always kind of call Al-Jilani in my heart.
yeah.
At some point I'm gonna have to make a video about him because he's probably one of the most interesting political figures in the Middle East today. I mean, his story is crazy. He went from shooting at American troops in Iraq to meeting with, potentially the United States to normalize relations with, or between Syria and the US. What a crazy twist his life has gone in and his career's gone in. But do you think that any kind of like massive cultural shift within Gaza is possible without some sort of a lasting Israeli presence, or I guess heavier hand on Palestinian affairs inside Gaza? One of the the first live stream that I had here was with a guy named Eric Garland, and he was basically dead. Like he was very sure that the only real solution would be for Israel to just annex Gaza. And I'm not quite sure I agree necessarily with that, but I want to get your thoughts on if that's realistic, one, but also if that would actually solve the problem or if that would just make matters a little bit worse and potentially far beyond Gaza. I know the David Accords kind of play into this as well.
Um, in my opinion, the best way that this could be solved probably, well, first of all, the longer this goes on, the more possible Trump's Gaza Lago, Gaza Riviera thing is. Like, if Hamas does not want to stop fighting and does not want to give up their weapons, and they just rejected another proposal in Cairo where they said we will not give up our weapons, and they're still actively recruiting, but the average age of their recruits is like 16 and a half years old. So these are not like sophisticated fighters or something that are going to be able to do October 7th again, but they're ready to join the cause. And that's terrible, right? To see like child soldiers being recruited and stuff. But so the longer they go off, I think the more possible it is that just like 70% of the people in Gaza leave on their own volition because they don't want to live in a war zone. In terms of like if the war were to stop, and it doesn't seem likely to me, or what you do about the West Bank, I think the best option, which would probably not be palatable to us in the United States at all, or to Europe at all, would be to do what the president of El Salvador did with arresting gang members in El Salvador, where he just basically I think he arrested all of the gang members and anybody that they suspected of a gang member. It's not very due processy at all. And they just put them all into jail. And then the other 60 or 70% of the population now can kind of live more peacefully there. It's actually becoming kind of prosperous. And I think if they did something like that, where they somewhat annex the land and then they, just really have a heavy hand with arrests, maybe that would work. But there's not really a great solution here, and definitely not one palatable to us in the West.
Yeah, and there are so many landmines, like political and strategic landmines, no matter what you do. It's really just kind of picking between bad choice A and bad choice B, worst choice C, potentially better, but still bad choice D, right? How would Egypt react to any of this? There's a guy I follow on Twitter. His @ is Victor Neumann, so check him out. He's a big Egypt guy, and I don't know if that's his. It's usually his like profile name's different, but he has been again very confident in saying Egypt will not accept anything, any kind of annexation of Gaza. It would be, they'd be tearing up the Camp David Accords. We'd be looking at way bigger potential conflicts than anything with Hezbollah. What are your thoughts on that?
I don't see, well, I think the peace between Israel and Egypt has always been a cold one.
Yeah.
There's a guy I follow, Jonathan Shanzer at Foundation for Defense of Democracies, and he studied in Egypt, and he said, like, the most popular song on the radio when I was studying for a summer in Cairo was "We Hate Israel," and it was just like talking about how much they hate Israel. Like, that's very popular there. Egypt has a lot of problems right now as well. They're like almost going to go to war with Ethiopia, right? Like over the dam situation. So to me, I don't think that that's as popular or possible that they would rip up the Camp David Accords. They would lose American support. We're reopening the Red Sea for them so that they can have money again. They've taken 200,000 Gazan refugees if they paid $10,000 a head. So now it would just be taking the rest that can't pay. And the payment would come through the U.S. reopening the Suez Canal. We provide them military equipment. So we're not going to let two states that we give military equipment to engage in a conflict. And if you look at the history of the Middle East, when leaders have civil unrest or something in their country and they don't want to deal with it themselves, they say, well, but we hate the Zionists, we hate Israel, so look over there. And that's kind of what you see Erdogan doing in Turkey too. So to quell those protests. So to me, that would be that's more where that's coming from, that sentiment in Egypt, more than an actual conflict going on there.
Yeah, and I'm kind of curious how much like the war in Ukraine, really more the build up to the war in Ukraine, is kind of messing with all of our minds. Because before that, it really just looked like Russia was posturing. You might remember April of 2021, they moved all these troops and all this heavy equipment to the border of Ukraine, no logistical assets, and it was pretty obviously like just posturing. And but it's still in the media to the untrained eye that's not looking at force composition. It looks like, oh man, they might do something in Ukraine. And so I'm kind of curious how much of it is that also with Egypt. The interesting thing with what Russia did was they pulled the troops back, but they left the heavy equipment there. And then in like December, January, they put the troops back, and then they started putting logistics in, and then it went from there. So yeah, a little curious on how much of that is potentially there with Egypt. I mean, you're right; they've got a lot of potential problems. They've got the conflict in the south, Sudan, which I believe they still border, right? If my geography is correct. My geography is not that great, but no, still further south.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay.
But now
right.
I'm questioning myself. No, I'm questioning myself. I can see the map, I think. I think it's Ethiopia is where the real I don't
right
with climate change and all. Ethiopia needs to build a dam so that they can give water and electricity to their growing population. But if there's just a 4% reduction in water flowing to Egypt because of that dam, that can like leave that entire valley without power and water, or like significantly less. And all of Egypt basically lives in that Alexander Valley there. So there's some real problems with that, and Somalia's entered in there. Like there's kind of a lot going on with that.
So I had to double check because I was going to lose my mind if I got this wrong. Their southern border is with Sudan. Other side of Sudan is Ethiopia. I knew that because we've been looking at the same maps. I've been looking at it for like the RSF Sudanese government war. But either way, that particular part of Africa, a lot going on. That does not hit the headlines at all for a number of reasons, but it's kind of nuts, honestly.
Well, and even if 25 years ago, I think if there were major problems in Africa, like under the Clinton administration, we would have had discussions in the United States about troops going in and helping there, and that just doesn't happen anymore. And that's because China really kind of runs Africa now. But so it is. But
also, we might need those troops for a hot war in other places too.
Right. So,
but yeah, I agree. We've got another question here from Dead War Dog. Interesting question here. How much is language a barrier to Israel annexing the Gaza Strip? It mentions El Salvador, with at least everybody speaking the same language. Not so much the case between Israel and Gaza per se.
So Gaza is one of the most literate places in the world. I don't know if people know that. Most people are literate there. Obviously, they speak Arabic. The second language in Israel is Arabic. They have a population of 2 million Arabic-speaking Arabs. So there wouldn't be too much of a problem there with integration. Also, a lot of them speak English, and most Israelis speak English. So Arab and Jewish. So
I think that's one of the most kind of underreported or underdiscussed features of Israel. Whenever people discuss Israel, is that they have a very large Arabic population. A large portion of the IDF are Israeli Arabs. So just a nice little demographics feature there that kind of, I think, it's forgotten in a lot of the more cultural conversations about Israel. But definitely covered some ground here. Back to
Iran.
Iran. I'm trying to think of what we haven't discussed here.
Do you think that we'll take that strike? Does it seem likely to you? Or let Israel?
I think Israel's the true wild card, because it's not just the existential question, the existential security threat that Iran can pose. And I mean, part of me isn't totally convinced that Iran doesn't already have a nuclear prototype, because there's been some rumblings about that as well the past few months. They've been, and I think we've talked about, at least in past live streams, that this kind of almost like a rolling title in news articles about Iran, that they've been like a week away from nuclear breakout, and that's been the case for like 6 months now. And before that, they were 2 weeks away. So they've been at that point where if they wanted to make a nuclear device, they could at any time. There's another feature of Iran's nuclear capability. Well, I should say their, and this includes their military, their ballistic missile capability. It's so deep underground. So
Mhm.
without human intelligence collection, which on the open source side, we're not gonna see. So we kind of have to take a stab at it with satellite and other kind of means. Um, we may not know if they have a nuclear device that's just held underground, and only the Ayatollah and a select few individuals in Iran know that that exists. And the worst thing that I think could happen is either Israel or us or both start striking targets in Iran, and then they throw out that prototype in a retaliation against like Tel Aviv or something. Not to say that that would happen. So I think that that kind of plays into the calculus on if we do a strike, or if Israel does a strike, because on one hand, you absolutely can't let them have a nuclear weapon, but on the other hand, and conversely, Iran can't let the U.S. and Israel keep them from having a nuclear weapon. It's two completely conflicting interests that are about as high stakes as it can get. All that is to say, this is I hate saying I don't know, but it really my read on it is if they can't agree to something, even if it's a bad deal in the next week or two, I think we probably will see something. If it's not us, then it's Israel taking matters into their own hands. Um, the scope of that, I think, is certainly a question. And past that, the effectiveness, certainly a question.
Mhm.
We've seen with the Houthis you know how many airstrikes that we've been throwing at the Houthis for years now, and the capabilities that we've been throwing at them, and they still keep they still stick around. They're still shooting down Reaper drones. They're still firing missiles into the ocean in the general direction of commercial traffic.
Mhm.
Um, and that's just the Houthis. Iran is, in terms of capability, um, a completely different ball game.
Yeah.
So
It'll
yeah,
be
so I'm
interesting to
kind of
watch.
yeah. Hopefully it doesn't get too interesting.
Yeah.
Hopefully it does not get too interesting. Um, I
Yeah.
kind of want to get an idea on um, how does religion kind of tie into Iran's narrative with the United States and Israel, because this is something that we see a lot. We see this with Gaza. We see this with Hezbollah. It's always in the language of it's all kind of veiled in we're doing this for Allah and we're doing this because it's our obligation. How does that tie a lot into Iran's kind of national story, um, or is it really more just about statecraft and kind of the old-fashioned sense?
Um, so I mean, you have obviously the Sunni and Shia divide, right? And I think the reason that the Iranians who are Shia want to, okay, the two holiest sites in Islam are in Mecca and Medina in Saudi Arabia. The third holiest site in Islam is Al Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, which sits on top of the Temple Mount, which is, you know, just right next to the
Convenient.
church. Yeah, right next to the Church of
Crazy
the
how
Holy
that happened.
Sepulchre. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And so um, what's interesting though is Al Aqsa Mosque really only has significance to Sunni Muslims. However,
Mm.
Shias, if Iran wants kind of regional domination, they want to be the ones to take Jerusalem because if they can take the Sunnis' holy spot, then all the Sunnis might become Shia. I'm really dumbing this down, but that's like kind of why they care about Jerusalem because it historically doesn't have like significance to Shias. Um, and so that's kind of the religious component. I mean, obviously there are the verses in the hadiths like Khaybar al-Yahud, which is the massacre of Jewish residents in Khaybar, which the Prophet Muhammad undertook. So there is like actually Iran will send Khaybar missiles at Jerusalem. They actually print in Hebrew on them, um, like Khaybar, I think. So that's interesting. There is that religious component, obviously, for the Iranians, like for the regime in Iran. But the Iranian people are not super religious actually. They're actually pretty secular. Um, like the people living there now, and they're pretty against their regime. I mean, there's millions of people who support the regime, but there's millions who don't, and the regime's on pretty shaky foundations there. So, um, I guess we'll have to see. But yeah, I mean, it's a conflict going back centuries, right? The Jews and
Mhm.
the Muslims, and within the Muslims, the Sunnis and Shias. So it's interesting to look at the conflict through that lens. And when you look at who is allied with and against the Iranians because of the Sunni Shia thing.
Yeah, and I think that's part of what makes it so fascinating to look at is exactly like you said, because this is a very, I mean, about as old as it gets in terms of
Mhm.
conflicts. There's just so much you can't really point to either side and say, oh, it's their fault, just because you can keep going back. You can keep going back. Um, Whenever you mention that Al Aqsa is not as important to the Shia, why is that? I'm kind of curious.
I don't know how far back I want to go. Well, I mean, to really go into detail, like there's certain hadiths that Shias follow and Sunnis follow, and really the difference between I mean, you're really testing my knowledge back here because I haven't
Yeah,
talked
no,
about
I'm
this in a
sorry.
while.
I don't mean to be
No,
like
no,
putting
no,
you
it's
on the
fine.
spot.
I
I'm
just
just
no, no. I
curious.
just
Yeah.
want to make sure. I just want to make sure I get this right. The Shias believe that like the living Ayatollah, or that there's an imam that can trace their roots back to the Prophet Muhammad, and really the Sunnis believe that the leader of Islam should be somebody who followed the words of the Prophet Muhammad, and the Shias believe that it should be someone who is a descendant, like a physical descendant of the Prophet Muhammad. And so that's kind of where that schism comes from, just in a really basic sense. And so they've always kind of been at odds ever since then. And then Shias, there's pockets of them in Houthi occupied Yemen, for instance, but they're a minority. And there's a few, like there's Shias in Iraq, in like northern Iraq and stuff. There's obviously Iran is majority Shia. There's Shias in Lebanon. Alawites are kind of Shia. They Bashar al-Assad was Alawite. There's a lot of Alawites in Syria. So it's very tribal. You know what I mean
Mhm.
in
Yeah.
that sense. So
Yeah, that makes sense. That's interesting. A group that you mentioned earlier when we were talking about Lebanon, but is certainly making the headlines a little bit with southern Syria, is the Druze.
mhm.
Would you mind going a little bit more in depth about them and kind of why they're important to both Israel and HTS as they're kind of trying to consolidate power in Syria?
Yeah, so the Druze are an ethno-religious minority that are kind of mostly in the Levant today. There's Druze in Israel, there's Druze in Syria, there's Druze in Lebanon, there's some in Jordan, I believe, and maybe Iraq. They started in Egypt, then they went down to Yemen, kind of became a people group. They actually wanted people to join for a while, and then they made their way up to the Levant. But um, they have they're kind of Muslim, but like they intermarry. They can't like if you marry with outside of the Druze faith, you can no longer be considered Druze. They believe in reincarnation. So they and it's a very secretive group too. So it's kind of hard to know exactly what they think. They don't teach it as outright. Like they have elders that kind of hold on to all the secrets of the Druze, but it's not like it's secretive, I guess is the best way to describe that. So um in Lebanon and in Syria, they see themselves as Arab for the most part, right? Like not fully Arab because they're in their own kind of thing. They have to, marry within each other and stuff. But in Israel, they're seen as much more separate from Arabs, which is interesting, even though they speak Arabic and stuff. They're very, very loyal to the Israeli government and to the state. They're very celebrated in Israel. They were some of the first to come in and say that they would, so in the IDF, you only have to fight in the IDF if you're a secular Jew. So they have mandatory service, 3 years for men and 2 years for women, I believe, right when you graduate from high school. But Arabs don't have mandatory conscription, but the Druze do. And the Druze kind of accepted that for themselves. So what's interesting is obviously you have very anti-Israel sentiment in Syria, traditionally and in Lebanon traditionally, but you have very, very pro-Israel sentiment from the Druze in Israel, which is, I think, is kind of causes confusion. And a lot of that, again, is just because the Druze don't see themselves as separate in Lebanon and Syria. So there's a lot of Druze living in like southern Syria, and they were worried when HTS took over because it's a former Al Qaeda affiliate, that they were going to go after the religious minorities because HTS is Sunni, Syria's majority Sunni, but it's very diverse. There's Christian minorities, there's the Alawites, there's the Druze, there's some Shia. And so what Israel said that they wanted to do is they wanted to and Kurds. I can't believe I just forgot them. So what Israel said that they would do is that they would push up into Syria to basically protect the Druze. There were some videos with Druze saying that they wanted Israel to help. Then there's a lot of Druze that don't want Israel to help too. And so it kind of becomes this propaganda war. What's interesting about Syria is that the Israelis kind of wanted to balkanize, like push to balkanize. So have a Kurdish state, a Druze state, an Alawite state, and then a middle state, which would be like majority Sunni. That's also what the Iranian regime wants. So it's funny that these two enemies want the same thing. Very interesting. It looks like if they were to balkanize, we would need U.S. troops to stay in place. It looks like we're going to withdraw from Syria. So if that becomes the case, then it will be kind of one contiguous Syrian state where we kind of see Turkey and Israel kind of ram up against each other, and we have to kind of try and keep the peace that way. So it'll be interesting to see, but it does not look like they'll balkanize, even though there are some people who say that the Druze want that.
Yeah, and I think that was like also a question with the I believe it was the SDF, the Kurdish faction in eastern Syria that was also, at least before they reunite, or I say reunited, they united with HTS and I guess reunited with a proper Syrian state, right? There was a thought that they might push for a proper Kurdistan, which might push a little bit into Iraq as well. Is there, and I think it's an interesting point that you made that both Israel and Iran kind of foresee the same thing for the Middle East. The current, I mean, as everybody knows, the current boundaries were drawn by like the British and the French, right? Like, how sustainable is right? Like, how sustainable are these current legal boundaries? At what point do they start to balkanize? Is that kind of an inevitability, or is it just kind of like we're just going to insist upon Syria is now this, Iraq is now this, and the Kurds are kind of spread, the Druze are kind of spread, same with Sunni and Shia?
So I think a problem with balkanization is that a lot of these groups live among each other, right? Like there's a Christian neighborhood and a Sunni neighborhood, and you're not going to be able to balkanize fully within the neighborhoods. Like the reason you have state boundaries is to have certain people be able to, it also considers land resources and things like that. So there is that kind of, I think that my personal opinion, Syria needs to remain in its current borders right now. I think if we look at the United States, when we were founded, we had a pretty rough 100 first years, right? We had a civil war. We fought we were invaded by the British and stuff. That kind of made us the country that we are today, but there was no concept of America before. We obviously pushed west all the way to the Pacific Ocean and stuff. There was no concept of what that would entail, and there was tension, right? In the Middle East, they were all under the Ottoman Empire until when did World War I end again? Like what year? Like the
17.
end of, 1917. Like,
18.
yeah, one of those. And like all of these countries started becoming countries in the 1930s and 40s. So yeah, I mean, it's going to be a little contentious for that 100 years or so, but I don't think that the right thing to do is to just start over. In my opinion, actually, if you look at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, has it worked out super well to have two groups of people that don't like each other, have to be heavily dependent on each other for resources and import and exporting things? No, I don't think that that's worked out very well.
Right.
And the two-state solution in a lot of ways was great in theory, but it hasn't worked. And so I don't think that we should try and recreate that failed strategy in other parts of the Middle East. I think that we need to hopefully have these people get together and this is maybe going off on another tangent too, but like that was going to be really hard to do when we saw such a push for Islamism really starting around the 1990s. We've really seen them move away from pushing towards like Islamic fundamentalism for the states and stuff. They're really embracing like modernity now. I think Islamism has iterated. After the fall of the Arab Spring and stuff, and that failure just bringing like chaos throughout the region. I think that the people of the Middle East crave stability now. And so I think it'll be a lot easier to have more secular states moving forward that aren't so adherent to Islamic fundamentalism. And I think that they can be prosperous that way.
That's interesting. I like that analogy of Israel kind of being that example of what happens if the rest of the Middle East were to balkanize. I think that makes complete sense. Do you think that it would that the Middle East could kind of follow a similar trajectory? I get that there's some significant differences here between like post World War II Europe and then the Middle East today. But do you think that that could be a potential direction where the Middle East continues to just, this push for modernity and stability kind of drives a more peaceful and prosperous Middle East with less conflict, similar to Europe post World War II, which was kind of counter to the historical trend up to that point?
Yeah, I think I think a lot of it will come down to how readily available Saudi money is and Emirati money and investment into some of these places. If they come in and say, hey, look, we will we will give you a lot of money, but you can't do this like kind of jihadism anymore. I think, yeah, there's probably potential for that. I think if you look at Jelani and he doesn't ever decide he wants to embrace jihadism again, yeah, I think it's definitely possible. There might be certain speeches that make people uncomfortable because those ideas that they go out and speak to and stuff are very popular over there. But ultimately, yeah, I mean, if they're not building up if you don't see groups like Hamas taking all of their aid money just to build tunnels underneath civilian infrastructure in order to one day wage a war, yeah, I think that this could probably go pretty well. But you can't have Iran expanding. You can't have, there a lot of things have to align. But I think that there is some kind of hope for that now in the Middle East for sure.
That's interesting. And I will concede kind of obviously it helped Europe in some ways to have two very large military powers kind of trying to invest and rebuild at the same time, almost in clashing vision. Well, not almost, literally in clashing visions for what the post-war order should be. There is no stabilizing force in the Middle East today like there was in Europe there.
Yeah, that's true too.
Like we're not, like the U.S. isn't occupying the whole Middle East and just shoveling money there to try to counter China, for example. It's still kind of a free for all. I'll kind of concede that as like a kind of like a weak part of my own, I guess, question there. But I think that is like kind of a very interesting point. We've talked a lot about Iran here. We've talked a lot about Gaza. We haven't talked a lot about Turkey, and we don't have a ton of time, but I'm kind of curious to get your thoughts on why does Erdogan, and I know that there's a protest, which you mentioned a little bit, why does Erdogan see that Turkey has to be moving down into Syria right now to meet Israel in some places? Is there a potential for any kind of a conflict between the two? With that, I believe I saw that they had discussions about deconfliction, and those discussions did not go particularly well. What are your thoughts on that?
It's interesting because Turkey is one of the countries that has the longest standing like kind of relationship with Israel, and I don't remember who described it this way. There's like a marriage component where they were out together and they would, visit each other, like the prime ministers would visit and stuff. And then you have like the mistress component where even though
Mhm.
they wouldn't acknowledge each other openly, they would still kind of coordinate. And I think the point of whoever said that, I'm blanking on who said that. The point that they were trying to make is we should not force the marriage thing. They can be fine as a mistress. Um, like look, America has two allies in the Middle East that can project power outside of their own borders. It's Turkey and it's Israel. Turkey can be really strategic in countering Russia in North Africa, and in Ukraine. I mean, they literally kicked Russia out of Syria. That's like such a big deal. Um, they're trying to push for Ukrainian NATO membership. I mean, like they can be a really good ally to us there, but they're pretty hostile to Israel too. So, especially with like rhetorically. And the Israelis, who looked like they might lose this war that was waged against them on 7 fronts up until about a year ago, now um, have kind of come out pretty victorious, besides the Iran question, and might be looking at, okay, well, we don't want to let ourselves get to the point where we were attacked on October 7th, so we need to take care of Turkey early. Um, I, I don't know where it goes, but I think that like they can probably put aside their differences and kind of get along, if they both want to remain allies of the United States. And eh, that's kind of where I would look at that there. Like they've had a long-standing relationship. They can continue to have a good relationship, even if they're not all buddy out in the open. And I guess when you asked about Syria, I mean, it's kind of interesting because what happened with the Assad regime falling is Erdogan wanted to negotiate with Bashar al-Assad and he wouldn't do it. And so he just wanted Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which Erdogan backs, to push, I think, only into Aleppo. And then they realized that the Russians and the Syrian army and the Iranians there were such paper tigers that they just decided to keep pushing down all the way to Damascus, kind of without the Turks, I think, I'm sorry, telling them to. So it'll be kind of interesting to see. I don't know. I don't think anybody thought Jelani would pull off what he did, and so to think that Erdogan was trying to use Hayat Tahrir al-Sham to take over Turkey, then go take over Israel. From everything I've read, that's not the truth. They just realized that there was kind of no backing of the Syrian regime anymore.
Right. No, that's good, and I completely agree that if they want to remain U.S. allies, then they're going to keep things amicable. I think the marriage analogy is a very interesting analogy with those two. That's a great analogy. There's so much to dive into that, but we are kind of running up on an hour. I don't want to hold you too late. I see the old doggo's kind of asking for you. So, no, you're good. And I appreciate you jumping on again. This has been fantastic. Perhaps we'll have to table the turkey conversation for a part 2 sometime.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much for having me. This has been so much fun. Yeah, super fun. Thank you.
Absolutely. And thank you everybody for watching. We'll see y'all next week, and we'll be talking right back next week's episode. See y'all later.